I wanted to share this quote that I came across from Norman Calder. He's quoted in a book called The Quran, Formative Interpretation. And he says something really interesting about oral narrative. He says, oral narrative is marked by instability of form and detail from version to version, and by an appropriate creative flexibility which makes of every rendering a unique work of art. Each version differs from another in various ways to present certain ideas, such as the importance of Ishmael over Isaac because he was the first child. I came across this as I was researching a little bit about the story of Abraham and Isaac from the Bible, because I believe it is one of the most impactful stories that has ever happened on this world. And I don't just say that because I'm a Christian or because I read from the Bible regularly and find inspiration from these stories. I say that from more of a global perspective. If you think about it, that story impacted Judaism and Islam and Christianity. And those three peoples cover 2/3 of the population of this world. 2/3 of the population on planet Earth know this story and look to this story as a source of intrigue, a source of study, and a source of inspiration. And to me, that is just so powerful. But the crazy thing about it is most people that are in walks of life in my immediate sphere are very familiar with the biblical version of the story of Abraham and Isaac. But I do know that there are other versions of this story. And this kind of harks back to what Norman Calder was saying here when he says oral narrative is marked by instability, right? It makes every telling a work of art, which instead of pushing away from this idea of having different versions of the story, because, you know, the historian and all of us, we don't want to hear two versions of the same story because we're left with often differing versions of a story are conflicting versions of a story. And the logical man inside of us says, what's the real version? What really happened? But if you take a step back and you say, what is the purpose of narrative? Then we can approach storytelling and sort of find balance or resolution inside ourselves in accepting that there can actually be multiple tellings, multiple versions of the same story, because the objective of the storytelling is different. Now, like I mentioned, Abraham and Isaac, if you're not familiar with that story, I recommend to go. I mean, I'm sure you can get on YouTube, you could get on Google, you could hear someone tell it, you could go read it in Genesis 22 in the Bible, and you're gonna find this story about Abraham who is asked to sacrifice his son. And he willingly goes and does it. It's the story of obedience, right? But as I was doing this studying, because I've also heard there are, not to ruin the story, but when Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac in the Bible telling, an angel stops him and says, good enough. God just needed to know that Abraham was willing, and that he stops him from actually killing Isaac. But I've heard that in some traditions and in some oral versions of the story, Abraham actually went through with it and kills Isaac. It becomes this ultimate example of sacrifice and obedience. And to modern day audiences, the idea of sacrificing your own son, of course, is just like awful. It's like, how could you? But what it does to the story is it totally reshapes the intention of the story. And so I did a little bit of digging on this, because I also know that inside of Islam, and I don't know a lot about it, and I apologize, any mistakes or any details that I mention of this that are incorrect, just know that it comes from a lack of experience in that sphere, but not for a lack of interest. I understand that Islamic telling of the story of Abraham and Ishmael, there is this different focus of, instead of the story being so focused on Abraham and his decision, actually Ishmael knows what's happening. He knows that Abraham has been asked to sacrifice him, and he goes along willingly. In fact, he tells Abraham, make sure to tie my hands behind my back and make sure that I am looking away so that I don't make it harder for you to go forward and do what God is asking. Like, I just retold the story of Abraham and Isaac, the version based on Abraham and Ishmael, and I just retold that story with a few different details. And do you see how it changes the story entirely? The focus becomes about Ishmael, and instead of Abraham being the one that is the amazing obedient one, Ishmael is also this shining pillar of true obedience to God's command. because he is willing to go with it. He's willing to sacrifice himself, knowing that it is what God wants. And ultimately, God intervenes. And I believe the Quran says that a greater sacrifice was made, whereas in the Bible, a ram is caught in a thicket and Abraham takes the ram and sacrifices it. I don't believe the Quran is that specific. It just says a greater sacrifice is made and Ishmael isn't sacrificed. But isn't that amazing what happens when we have these retellings of the same story? And for a long time, like me, I believe there are many people that have a hard time with this. And I believe this manifests in this long debate that I have had to straddle for so long, which is books versus movies. Because often movies find their stories in books and they want to retell them, but the mediums are so different. And often the filmmakers themselves are looking for a different approach to the story, and we balk at it. We are resistant to it. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people say, oh, the book is always better than the movie. But I went to film school. I got a degree in screenwriting. I love books. I love movies. And I feel like I'm in this world where I'm constantly straddling the two worlds of movie storytelling and book storytelling and having to rectify this argument of which is better. And I believe the answer comes down to look to the source, the original source of narrative, which is oral storytelling. And you find that stories are intended to be shaped with time. They often have multiple versions and multiple tellings, and why shouldn't they? Why can't we have a world where we can digest and glean and learn and be inspired by multiple versions of the same story? Because I have to be totally honest, I believe that every time a human being verbally tells a story, it will be different. And we leave out details, we remember other details, or if two people witness the same event, they will tell the story different. So it's really hard to say what is the definitive version of a story. And instead, I say we embrace all versions of the story.